Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And it's been a while since part one, but Andrew Whitmarsh returns to continue sharing his expertise regarding landing craft in Normandy based on his outstanding book. Here's my copy, D-Day Landing Craft. And the links to the purchase of the book are in the description below, or you can find it, of course, at your local bookstore or library. And today we are looking at D-Day itself and what happened after D-Day, the wider kind of Battle of the Seine, which will dovetail nicely with what Stephen Fisher talked about last week, when not all the fleet, but some of the fleet goes off to the Scheldt Estuary in October, November. But I'll bring Andrew in now. Good evening, sir. How are you today?
Yeah, good, Paul. Thanks for asking me on again. And just to reassure people that we're not planning there'll be a part 3, so there is an end.
No, unless something major happens in landing craft development in the next few months. But yeah, we are going to do a recap of what we talked about in the first show. But you've come on with your PowerPoint, so I'll bring it up, folks. Fire away with questions and comments, but if you watched part one, you'll realize a lot of the stuff probably will be covered by Andrew as we go along, but there'll be a bit more in the way of personal story in this one. But I'll hand over to my guest to take us into part 2. So over to you, sir.
Great, thanks. So it was a bit tricky to pick the starting image, because how do you pick one image that sums up landing craft and D-Day and the Battle of Normandy and overall? But just to mention that, because you'll be looking at that. So this is a landing craft infantry large LCIL on Omaha Beach, as you can see, under really heavy fire. You can see all the beach obstacles around it, so representing the kind of danger that a lot of the landing craft were in, the dangers that the crew experienced, etc. But just as a starting point, which I kind of probably mentioned a bit previously, is why do I think this is an angle of D-Day and Battle of Normandy that's worth exploring? And I think when people think about D-Day, they probably almost literally, like the first minutes of Saving Private Ryan, landing craft probably feature briefly at the start, more as a vehicle for delivery of the leading characters. But then the focus tends to move onto the beach and then further inland, and we kind of forget that pretty much all of the troops arriving at the beaches were arriving on landing craft. So they're important not just at the start of D-Day, but throughout the whole of D-Day, and of course before it, where do they all come from, and after it as well, because they don't just stop operating at the end of D-Day. And also because there are a really substantial number of people, all the crews. So it's something like a third or over a third of the Allied naval personnel in Operation Neptune were on landing craft and landing ships. And
wow.
I kind of mentioned the difference between those two in a minute, and I'll in the previous one rather, and I'll mention it again in a moment. But I'm just curious actually to ask the audience if there's anyone watching who's a relative of a landing craft veteran, or someone who knew a landing craft veteran well, because it would just be interesting to hear from them. Although the book is called D-Day Landing Craft and talking about landing craft, obviously it's equally as much about the people, about the crews, as about the inanimate landing craft. And here we've got 2 photos, again, just to represent only part of the sort of big varied picture of the landing craft. So on the left, a Canadian, Stoker E. Nixon of the Royal Canadian Volunteer Reserve, on an LCIL, and on the right, Royal Marines on a landing craft support medium, actually in Holland. So it's not a Normandy picture, but it shows nicely the mortar and the machine gun turret on them. And Royal Marines were manning quite a number of different sorts of landing craft, and they'll get mentions as we go as well. Also, the crews were, as you'd expect, the Royal Navy and the US Navy, and also the US Coast Guard are manning a substantial number of landing craft. So there's really quite a large range of different services who are involved. And I just want to start with a couple of stories relating to the crews, just so a bit of a sort of flavour of some of their experiences, and why this story of landing craft and the crews kind of captured my imagination to the extent that I went to the trouble of writing a book. And one was quite a funny story, really, as lots of veterans have funny stories when they're talking about their experiences. So this one relates to George Carpenter, who was a signalman on LCT 974. So he was doing his Royal Navy training, and at the particular camp he was at, regularly there'd be lists posted of the personnel who'd finished their training and were going on to their first posting. And he kept on seeing the same ship mentioned again and again, HMS Copra. So many people were being sent there. He kind of imagined this was some kind of enormous battleship or something, or some really impressive ship. And when his time came too, he too was posted to HMS Copra. And then he found out that this wasn't actually a ship. It was a shore base, but actually he wasn't in fact posted there. This was purely for administrative purposes. He was kind of on the books of HMS Copra. Actually, what that meant, he was going to combined operations, going to landing craft. And a lot of landing craft crew or veterans talk about this moment when they suddenly realize kind of quite what they're in for. They have a moment of deflation when the impressive ship they imagine turns out to be quite less impressive. But then generally they go on to really to love their particular landing craft or their particular vessel and enjoy some of the aspects of being on a landing craft that were a bit different. And actually, on a more serious point of view, one of this HMS Copra connection that in the veterans' records quite often makes it quite hard for the families of British landing craft veterans to actually find out which actual landing craft a veteran was served on. Even you see it on some gravestones in Normandy. So that's a bit of a downside to that. So that's one story. Another story took place on DDay on Juno Beach at Saint-Aubin. So this was just before midday, and LCT 707 had just delivered some Royal Canadian artillery units to the shore, and the landing craft was now broached to, so side onto the beach, so it couldn't immediately get off. And some German troops had infiltrated back into a mortar position only about 15 yards from the beach, or from the craft rather, and then they began firing their mortar at this LCT. Slightly strange, because what were they obviously hoping to do some damage, but overall what they're trying to achieve, I'm not sure. So the mortar bombs started falling on the LCT, and so one landed on the deck, and one of the crew, leading stoker, gambled threw it overboard, and then another sailor, leading wireman Pettit, engaged the enemy position with one of the LCT's 20mm Oerlikons, which was for anti-aircraft or anti-shipping defense. But the gun jammed, and he was killed by enemy rifle fire. And then the commanding officer, Lieutenant Alfred Hollins, gets out the craft's Lanchester submachine gun. So this was carried for a sort of emergency use, and probably virtually no one ever used it. But he gets the gun out and starts firing at the German position, but he's mortally wounded by several more mortar bombs that hit the craft. And then the second in command, the first lieutenant, Midshipman Fowler, has to take over. So he orders the crew ashore. He finds an army doctor to care for the wounded. He sources a bulldozer that then, once the crew are back on board, pushes the LCT out to sea. And then when he gets underway at sea, he discovers that the propellers of the LCT are sheared off, so he can only steer by varying the speed of the two engines. And when I read this at the National Archives, this story of this little gun battle between the crew of the LCT and this German mortar position at a time when things are quite relatively
theoretically, it's over the worst. Yeah.
It really kind of captured my imagination. And then the third story, before we really get underway, is at Omaha Beach at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And there was a US Navy officer, Ensign Joseph A. Sullivan, was leading a group of 12 LCVPs, so small landing craft, carrying jeeps. They came under fire as they went ashore, and then as Sullivan's craft actually hit the beach, a beach obstacle stuck a hole in the bottom of his craft, so he landed the jeep. But then he had basically an out of action landing craft, and the easy option would have been to go ashore, find another landing craft to get a lift back on, and abandon his vessel. But he and his crew were determined to save their craft, because they knew they needed to be used again. So he and his crew repaired the hole in the bottom of their craft, but the only materials they had to do this were the signboard that they had on their craft, depicting the wave number, because their craft is actually leading it. So they use the wood and the nails from the sign to patch up the hole in the bottom, and then stuff life jackets into what remained of the hole, and manage to actually get their little landing craft back to the main ship, which was an example of another example of landing craft crews being put in a difficult position and really pulling the stops out. Maybe that's the wrong expression in this case, to save their craft and to do their duty. So that was just to give a kind of little bit of a flavour, and why I'm enthusiastic about the story of the cruise.
Well, and again, while that photo is there, before you move on, that photo on the right, to me, that typifies that sort of idiosyncratic, not quite Royal Navy, not quite. They fall into a different category of personnel. You know, the berets there, the sheepskin jackets. It wasn't quite the strict, rules you sometimes get on a destroyer or a cruiser with the Royal Navy. It's not, but it's not like the commandos or the infantry. Either it sort of falls in this sort of individual category. And reading your book, obviously you've got an affection for the tech, for the gear, for the model types and innovations, but clearly the people shine through as the kind of individuals who ended up in these boats of literally all shapes and sizes and doing all sorts of roles. And that photo there sums it up. That if you didn't know anything, you could who could those? They could be commandos, they could be anybody, those guys, couldn't they?
Yeah, and they're comparatively well dressed in terms of wearing proper uniforms. There's lots of photos of landing craft crew, particularly getting on a bit more into the operation, where they're barely wearing any proper uniform. And I guess if you were the commanding officer of that little craft, you'd probably feel like you had your own little destroyer, because it hasn't got a huge amount of firepower, but it's quite a decent amount of firepower for a small craft.
Yeah, definitely.
So just to do a little bit of a recap and kind of signpost people to the previous episode, if anyone hasn't seen that yet and is interested. So I talked a bit and talk in the book about the huge effort that the Allies went to assemble the fleet of landing craft that were needed for D-Day, and even to the extent of it being a regular topic for the top Allied leaders at their various meetings. And the problem is partly of the Allies' own mistake, because they keep on using the landing craft for other campaigns, and that's one of the reasons why they are scrabbling around to find so many. So here we've got a photograph of LCT Mark 6s being built in the US. So many landing craft and landing ships being built in the US. Lots built in the UK as well. The couple of key features, which obviously may well be obvious to land, for the landing craft need to have, are generally a flat bottom, so they can go up on a beach, and a ramp at the bow. You can see the bow ramps, or at least the space where they'll go on the right side of this photograph, so the troops on board can rapidly get off and onto the beach, troops or vehicles. But then there are some landing craft, like the one with the Royal Marines on that we looked at just now, that have different roles, so like fire support or command. Sometimes those are conversions of other existing types. Sometimes they're specially designed, but most of these designs of craft are all developed during the Second World War. So before the war, there's some sort of toe in the water experiments, but the armed services overall aren't really taking it seriously until there's a need. So the designs are evolving a bit as they're actually going along. Here we've got another LCT on the deck of an LST, a landing ship tank. So it's a bit hard to make out maybe, but you can, the bow of the LST is to the left, the stern, the rear is off to the right. And you can see that they were specially designed, the LCTs, so they could sit on the deck, be carried on the deck of an LST to get them across the Atlantic or other oceans, because an LCT was too small to cross the Atlantic. And the other oceans thing is part of the problem in terms of gathering all the landing craft together, because in January 1944, the LSTs, LCTs, and LCILs, landing craft infantry large, this was a type that could carry about 200 personnel on foot. The proportions that there are the US versus the Pacific were about 50-50. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons why it was hard to find landing craft for D-Day, because a lot of them were sent to the US. And then one thing that quite amazed me was on D-Day, after this long period of scrabbling around trying to find enough landing craft, in the documents of the Royal Navy's Portsmouth Command, which includes all the assault forces except those going to Utah Beach, there's actually a surplus of 4 LSTs, 44 LCTs, and 6 LCILs, and they're actually loaded on D-Day itself and then arrive at Normandy shortly afterwards. So, and I can only think that this was because the maintenance levels, in other words, how many were out of service, they ended up that they had more in service than had been predicted. So that's a slightly weird situation to end up in with actually a surplus. And I think I mentioned briefly last time about the number of landing craft. But again, just to recap, so the number 4,126 is in the subtitle of my book. And I knew that putting that in, probably a proportion of readers, and so possibly some in the audience, would start twitching at that, because they'd start thinking, well, hang on, there's a but to that. And so here is some of the breakdown of that number. So on the left, those are all landing craft.
Oh, I think Andrew has frozen. Hang on, we'll try and get him back. Talk amongst yourselves, folks. I'm not sure what's happened with Andrew's internet. Well, hopefully we'll be back in a minute.
And
we lost you there for a minute or so, Andrew. I think you've come back. We heard you again. Say something. Oh.
How are we doing?
I think you're back now. We got as far as you saying that you were going to explain the breakdown.
Okay, so the left-hand side of the left-hand column are some of the types of landing craft, and then the right-hand side are other types that are related to landing craft in certain ways that were sometimes at the time people actually lumped in with what they called landing craft, but technically weren't. And I'll show you some images of them as we go along at different points. But so I've mentioned LSTs already. Landing barges were conversions of civilian barges, so they weren't proper assault craft. And the troop transports were much bigger troop-carrying vehicles, troop-carrying ships rather, that would carry landing craft on their sides. But that's just the point. The point about the number. So in some ways, the exact number doesn't matter too much. It's kind of a sort of starting point for the conversation. And just to say something about sources briefly. So as you might expect, the UK National Archives had loads of great material, lots of reports done by the various landing craft flotillas and individual officers at the time, and also the material from the US National Archives on fold3.com, which is a great source. And the WW2 Talk forum has loads of really useful information, particularly just to single one person out in particular. There's a guy called Mike or Trucks who's listed a lot of information from various records on there of the different ways of landing craft and the units they were carrying, which is a really excellent source. And then from the place I work, although the book I should mention was done in my own time, the D-Day story has the archive of the LST and Landing Craft Association, which is all on the museum's website. And there's lots and lots of hundreds of accounts mostly by British veterans writing really eloquently about their experiences, and they were gathered by Tony Chapman, who was the archivist of the association. And so what I was trying to do with the book was combine some of these sort of official records with the more anecdotal accounts from the veterans try and get both a sort of reference source of what was happening when, but also a bit about what it was like being there and what you could see when you were looking around, and what it was, what the veterans actually felt at the time. And then in terms of things leading up to D-Day, as we all know, D-Day was planned in huge detail, and clearly with landing craft that had to be planned, the detail of what troops you'd fit on each landing craft. The image at the bottom there is part of as you can see, a landing diagram. Basically, the detail won't be possible to make out, but each of the little markings going across the page is a different landing craft, and so there were all sorts of documents to plan which troops would be on which landing craft. Essentially, it started with the naval planners allocating the landing craft to the beaches, and then the army said what they wanted to load on each landing craft, and then the navy said, you can't do that, that won't work. And then there's a back and forth until they actually got to a sort of workable point to create these kind of documents that meant that when the troops were moving down to the embarkation points in the UK, they had a specific landing craft they were looking out for, etc. And we're all familiar with this map showing where the main assault forces and the follow-up forces, B in the west and L in the east, came from. So all of those naval forces had landing craft and landing ships in with them, and to get them all from the places where they were to the places they needed to be at the relevant beach was obviously quite a complicated process. You didn't want huge numbers of ships and landing craft turning up at the beaches too early, because it would just completely clog the place up. And you had to factor in the speeds of different landing craft. So essentially, to cut a story short, those that were faster, as you might expect, left a bit later on because they could because they were faster. And then one, in terms of the experience of the troops on board, a big aspect of it involves people's stomachs, really. If you're on a larger ship, particularly a larger US ship, you could actually have quite an amazing selection of food. So LST 522 was with the US Navy, and they around this time had for breakfast cold oranges, bacon, eggs, cereal, and milk. Lunch included breaded short pork chops, candied yams, and spaghetti. And for dinner, amongst other things, steamed frankfurters, sauerkraut, and rice pudding. So that could be quite a spread. But then, in contrast, some of the smaller landing craft, the experience of the troops on board was really pretty bad. And this is Midshipman Derek Brightman of the Royal Navy talking about an LCT anchored in the Solent. So it's anchored; it's not even out in the sea, the open sea at this point. And he said, an LCT is an absolute bitch in any sort of rough sea. An anchor she rides and pitches like the very devil. The army personnel were dreadfully sick. And this is a brilliant line. At first, with seasickness, you fear you're going to die, but then you become afraid that you might live. So, as I mentioned, different convoys set off at different times. To avoid strain on the engines, they weren't all going flat out. So they were generally going either at 12 knots for the faster vessels, or 5 for the slower ones. And so you can probably can't make out all the details here, but each of the little arrows heading across the channel is a different convoy. So those going to the darker ones down at the towards the getting closer to Normandy, as you'd expect, those that are going to land earlier on D-Day. A bit further back, there's some oats of white arrows, which are the bombardment ships heading across. So because those warships are so much faster, as I said, they could set off later and make up the distance and get there in time. And then actually, just visible setting off from the coast from the Solent area, and a few other places, there's some of the follow-up convoys that were going to be landing later on, involved later on. You can see for the US beaches, perhaps that depending on the size of your screen, that whereas for the Anglo-Canadian beaches they have lots of smaller convoys, for the Americans they had two, for one for each of the two beaches, Utah and Omaha, really big convoys of something. They had a few more, but particularly several really big ones that could be up to something like 300 ships and landing craft. And they're so big that they would take 3 hours to arrive at the beach. So the front would start, and then it would take 3 hours for the rest of the convoy to arrive, which was fine because they didn't all need to be there at that one time. But it did mean it was a massive ships, and the commander of the or one of the US commanders anyway pointed out that this was potentially a really big problem, that these really slow landing craft, because they were stretched out over such a long distance, not that well protected, were vulnerable to enemy attack. Fortunately, the Germans didn't have a really substantial force that could come out and attack them as they were crossing, but that he pointed out was a potential problem. And the actual experience of making the crossing for the smaller landing craft was pretty bad. A lot of the small landing craft were carried by bigger ships, but there were some, such as the LCAHR (brackets landing craft assault (brackets hedgerow), which were we'll see a photograph of those in a moment, but they were on the deck, had lots of spigot mortars.
Oh. Andrew seems to have frozen again. Well, we'll bring him back in a minute. Hopefully he'll come back on. We were at spigot mortars. Can you still hear me, Andrew? And by the way, folks, I am saving your questions for later on, if we can get through these gremlins.
Abandoned.
We lost you again there, Andrew. We got as far as spigot mortars.
Hi, did we lose each other again?
Yeah, I lost you for a bit. We got as far as spigots.
Yes, okay. So these LCAHRs, those going to Sword Beach, there were 9 going to Sword Beach, towed by LCTs, by larger landing craft, and only one of the 9 managed to cross in time. 5 get swamped by the sea and sunk. 3 come adrift. Often the crew are okay; they manage to get onto the LCT towing them. But so only 1 out of 9 managed to cross these because of the size of these craft. And I think it struck me that when we tell the story of D-Day, or at least when I do, but I suspect other people do it as well, we tell the story about how the Allied commanders meeting at Southwark House, the weather forecast, it was predicted to be bad weather for the 5th of June, so it was postponed. But then for the 6th of June, the forecast was better, and so in reality, it turned out to be better, not great weather, but it was good enough, and the operation went ahead and successful. And it's the crews of these little landing craft are some of the people who are really experiencing just how close to the margin of it not working at all things really were. So when we sort of lightly dismiss it as being good enough, actually they'd probably have said had something slightly different to say.
Yeah.
So a big part of the early stages of the landings is the big transport ships, the landing ship infantry, or APAs, as the Americans call a lot of their equivalents, like this one. This is HMCS Prince Henry with some LCAs in the foreground, and you may just be able to see on the ship some of these sort of L-shaped davits that the LCAs would have been carried on board to make the crossing. So quite a few miles off the coast, so for about 7 or so miles for the British and Canadian beaches, up to about 13 even for the American beaches, 11 to 13. These big ships anchor to keep them well out of range of the German guns. And this is known as the transport area for the US and the lowering position for the UK, but it's the same thing. It's an area that's been swept by minesweepers so that these big ships, because these big ships are so important, there's a lot of eggs in one basket on board, so they need to be protected as much as possible. And based on exercises held before D-Day, one senior US Navy officer later remarked that it wasn't a question of whether there would be confusion, but whether the confusion would become chaos. So keeping control of this was something that they had a lot of paid quite a lot of attention to. There were two ways that the troops could get onto these little landing craft. So one was known as rail loading, and this was where the landing craft was on the ship's sides on the davits, and the troops could simply step quite comfortably into the landing craft. So that bit was fine. But then Marine Edward Neal describes here about launching his LCA from HMS Glenurton. So he says, the waves ran under the keel, lifting them up and causing them to fall back onto the hooks with a shuddering jolt. The davit hooks had to be released at exactly the same moment. If not, the craft would be left hanging by one davit, and everything would have been thrown into the sea. Finally, by the grace of God, we managed to release the craft and were smashed against the side of the ship before being hurtled forward and on our way, all soaked to the skin and looking a very sorry bunch of humanity. So although that sounds the great option, as he makes it clear, it wasn't without risk, and they ended up completely soaked. The other possibility is that the landing craft were launched empty, and then the troops had to climb down the side, nets down the side. And then my favourite, there was a British invention known as the Helter Skelter, and as the name suggests from the fairground ride, this was actually a canvas chute for delivering things from the ship's side into the landing craft, but apparently it was easily damaged if troops went down it, so not used so often.
Too many sharp things, bayonets and things protruding to make that work.
Yes,
I'm just thinking of all the various D-Day accounts I've read, and I'm thinking they either don't mention the mounting of the landing craft at all, because I assume the person involved had a really good one, or it's like 10 pages of the horror of it. Oh, I thought I was going to drown. It was terrible. And I guess that's the experience. If your experience happened to be pretty good, your convoy wasn't particularly affected by the weather, your embarkation was pretty good, you kind of, compared to what happened later on D-Day, it was a minor thing. But if it happened to be hell on earth, you would absolutely remember it. That seems to be my recollection. So either one or the other, right? Either it was fine or it was nearly very, very awful.
Yeah, and quite a lot of the both the Royal Navy or naval officers, or maybe sometimes the troops as well, but certainly the naval officers in writing reports afterwards talk about the value of doing training up in Scotland.
Yeah.
In really bad weather, and also because that prepared them for D-Day, and also some other troops or other landing craft crews where they hadn't gone through that kind of really rough weather training, and they really suffered on D-Day because it was all new to them.
Yeah, no, good point. Thank you.
So I mentioned the importance of controlling all the landing craft. So here's a painting off Omaha Beach. And you can see the great variety of landing craft milling around, as one of the reports described it. The problems with this problem was particularly bad at Omaha Beach because obviously the extent of the German resistance there, and then the difficulties in clearing many of the beach obstacles. It was hard particularly for the bigger landing craft to find places to beach. So they were just circling offshore, trying to spot a place to land. So the group of landing craft would either have crossed the channel together or would have all been launched from the same ship and gathered together and headed for the beach. There was a line, an imaginary line about 3,500, 4,500 yards out from the beach, known as the line of departure. Sometimes they pause the landing craft there and then send them in at the right time. So there was quite an effort to trying to control them. But if you look at the plans for the succession of waves landing on D-Day, quite often there's maybe, particularly earlier in the day, sometimes say 15 minutes between successive waves, and obviously it wouldn't have taken much for one to be running a bit late, one to be a bit early, and generally for things to get a bit more mixed up. People quite often use the expression first wave, and as in someone landed in the first wave. And often I think this is not necessarily strictly correct. So strictly, they often use it to mean it just that someone landed or their craft beached early on D-Day or in the morning of D-Day, even I suspect. Strictly speaking, the first wave was literally the first group of landing craft to hit that particular section of beach, and then the next group, even if they were say 15 minutes later, would be wave 2 and so on. Before any landing craft actually touched the beach, though, a really important role was fire support. So here on the left, we've got one of those LCA HR landing craft assault hedgerow. It hasn't got all of the spigot mortars fitted, but it's got some of them you can see fitted in the space where the troops would normally be. So these are really little craft. And then on the right, they're kind of a big brother, if you like, an LCT brackets R landing craft tank rocket. So this had the tank deck where the vehicles would normally be carried was decks over, and then these launchers that you can see here were put to carry that could fire. So there'd be a couple of different variants, but basically about 1,000 rockets that could be fired against the beach. The rockets aren't installed here, but it gives you a view of all the different launchers, and this is looking towards the stern of this landing craft. So there was a whole as the all of the landing craft approached the beaches for the first waves of landing craft. There was a whole succession of different fire support landing craft that would fire. So there were. This is obviously in addition to the bigger warships and to aircraft that had been involved as well, or were involved at the same time. So there were landing craft gun large LCGLs, which had two 4.7-inch guns, so destroyer type guns, but they could, because they had a flat bottom, they could go much closer into the beach. Landing craft support large LCSLs, which had 6-pounder guns, basically a lighter sort of anti-tank gun. Landing craft flak LCFs that had anti-aircraft guns, but even though there weren't a lot of German aircraft around to speak of, they were still useful for firing against enemy positions. And they had their limitations though, and the perhaps the most or best way to illustrate this is there's on Gold Beach, there's what's known as the Stan, now known as the Stan Hollis shelter, because it's got a plaque commemorating the guy who won the VC. And this was actually it appeared on photo or reconnaissance photographs, etc., like a pillbox. So it had actually been targeted by three fire support landing craft and also 2 destroyers firing in that area, and still it survived. So but that's not typical of their how they always were. So there's a number of beaches where they reported as doing a really good job in firing to help with the assault. But these landing craft fitted with their own guns weren't enough. The Allies were trying to simply get enough. It's often expressed in terms of weight of explosive on target. So it's literally weight of shells effectively falling on the beach. They were really trying to plaster the whole area with as much firepower as possible to either obviously kill German defenders or destroy positions, but even more importantly, probably just to suppress them before the troops landed. So there's various LCTs together referred to as LCT bracket A. A stood for armoured, and there's some other types as well. But basically, they had a sort of raised platform near the bow, which could fit 2 tanks on. That as the landing craft was approaching the beach, for potentially for about half an hour, that those 2 tanks could be firing at targets ashore. And similarly, there were self-propelled artillery on LCTs that would do what they called the run and shoot. As the LCT was approaching the beaches, all the guns, so often 4 guns per LCT, but it depended on the size, would all be firing in Juno Beach, for example. That total was 96 guns, all firing at targets inland or on the beach or inland. Obviously, the individual guns weren't. That was aimed by the LCT direction of the LCT, so that was adding a substantial amount of fire as well. And then one of the very last minute was what the right-hand image here, the LCT are firing all its rockets, not all in one go, because it would probably have sunk if it had fired all 1,000 in one go, but firing sequences of them. And these craft get mentioned in lots of veterans' accounts of the assault troops, because the rockets are firing actually over their heads, and it was clearly quite a memorable sound and a surprising sound, I guess, because the troops perhaps hadn't heard that before. They also get quite a bad press. They always seem to be being accused of falling short, of firing, not firing close enough to the enemy and firing too close to friendly troops. Some of that, no doubt, may have been true. And then after the troops have gone ashore, the support landing craft are still being used, but not the rocket equipped ones, because they've used their fire already. But the gun equipped ones, they tend to be more on the flanks, but sometimes mixing in where the assault troops still are. There's a few occasions where there's actual German positions that are suppressed by landing craft, these fire support landing craft coming in really close and firing at them.
Just a quick question for you, Andrew. You talked about the rockets having a kind of a mixed press, so to speak. In your research into landing craft, are we all a little bit burdened by the over talking about Omaha Beach, in that the Omaha Beach experience has come to represent the experience of all 5 landing beaches, because it's the one that kind of shapes our understanding, and so if something happened on Omaha Beach, there's a general understanding that it happened on all 5 beaches, which couldn't be further from the case, in that all the beaches have their own distinct problems and issues and things that went well and different. But do you think there was kind of a bit of an overemphasis on Omaha in the writing, not so much the contemporary writing, but the post-war writing?
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like that. And actually, when I get to Utah Beach, I think if you look at Utah Beach from the landing craft point of view, it's very, very different from the kind of the beach where everything went well, which is probably where how a lot of us describe it, if we're just giving the kind of top level summary of what happened on each beach. With Omaha Beach, for example, one of the naval commanders did ask, well, when it was maybe around about the middle of the day, ask about using an LCTR again, because they actually below decks had more rockets, so they had another reload worth of rockets, and I think quite often they would borrow personnel from another ship, a large warship, to have more people to reload them. But I think one of the LCTRs, or maybe more than one, had actually reloaded, and later in the day on D-Day at Omaha Beach, there was a naval commander who asked about firing again to try and suppress some of the remaining German defenders, but he was told it wasn't suitable because it was too hard to distinguish where the as you expect, where the enemy was and where friendly troops were. And so, yeah, obviously there were limitations to these craft. Yeah, but no, I think you're right about Omaha kind of overshadowing things, definitely.
Brilliant. Okay.
And then the last thing to mention that was generally the next thing that's happening after what I've just described is LCTs carrying DD tanks, the amphibious tanks, which and this part of the story is quite well known. Either be launched. Well, the plan was to launch them so they would arrive about HA, about when the assault troops were landing. Obviously, in some beaches they weren't because the commanders on the spot judged the sea was too rough, so they were they either dropped onto the beach directly or went in only the last short distance. And so that was that carried on, as I said, carried on LCTs. And in terms of the experience of the landing craft crews as they were approaching the beach, landing craft generally all had pretty small crews. So as they approached the beach, particularly on D-Day, particularly when there's enemy resistance present or likely, they'd all have different roles. So on an LCT, for example, the first lieutenant, who's the second in command, would be at the bow to supervise the lowering and the raising of the ramp, the bow door. There would be another crew at the bow to operate the winches. So on British LCTs, these were manual winches. So lowering the bow door was fairly straightforward because you had gravity on your side. But then to get it up again, as the landing craft was coming back off the beach, was just done by brute force on the British landing craft. And then you'd have had more crew manning another winch at the stern of the craft, because as the LCT approached the beach, they'd have dropped an anchor behind them, a kedge hook as it was referred to, which was used for hauling the LCT back off the beach as they were coming off. They'd have had other crew on the guns and so on and so forth. So basically, they'd all have been at their positions. The commanding officer of the landing craft was responsible for confirming the depth of the water at the ramp, and then the army officer, in theory, could refuse to land if he wasn't satisfied with that. The orders for the landing craft crews would generally just stress that their purpose was to deliver the troops to the shore, and don't worry too much about getting off the beach, but just get your landing craft onto the beach and get the troops or the vehicles into as shallow water as possible. That's your job. And generally that does seem to be the attitude that the crews had. On some landing craft, such as the LCILs, for example, they actually send one or two crewmen ashore with a line. So these sailors would be standing on the beach holding a rope attached to the landing craft, so that the troops coming off had something to cling on to, because they'd have been obviously much more heavily loaded. So there's cases like that where the crews are really exposing themselves to enemy fire. Occasionally there's stories you read about supposedly cowardly landing craft crews being reluctant to put their landing craft right up onto the beach, and even the army officer on board them having to brandish a weapon or something to persuade them to get ashore. And I mean, who's to say that something like that didn't happen somewhere? But generally, that's massively overblown, and it was equally likely, in fact, and this generally doesn't get talked about to sort of go alongside the sort of stories that I just talked about. Equally, you had the personnel on board, the troops, sometimes not often, but occasionally refusing to go ashore. And actually, one example of this is in the LCVP, the small landing craft that Ernest Hemingway, the reporter, was on board. So his craft was due to touch down at 8:45, but apparently the army lieutenant on board refused to land. So his group of 4 LCVPs waited off the beach. They finally beached at 13:15, so still quite a long time later. And the records of the ship that the landing craft came from say Army Lieutenant refused to leave the boat until shamed into doing so by Mr. Hemingway.
Wow.
And so we're not passing any judgment here, because I wouldn't want to go ashore on the beach on D-Day, but I think it's good to have that as the parallel to go with the stories of.
For fear of going down a massive great rabbit hole, but it does kind of bring up that subject of the kind of the 1950s, 60s, 70s writing, where people were always pointing out the dramatic exceptions to the rule rather than the rule, and the story of the landing craft coxswain being brought in at gunpoint at Omaha that Stephen Ambrose perpetuated for years. Was clearly against the run of play, if it ever happened at all, and like the troop carrier pilots being all cowardly was a narrative that I guess sold books for people. But we're now getting to the point now where we're in the work you're doing, we're looking at the average performance, because that's what's more indicative of the general situation, is what was happening mostly. And what was obviously happening mostly is most landing craft were depositing their people. There was obviously fear, there was obviously situations, but this idea of outright cowardice, if it ever happened, it's a rare occasion, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. And there's so many stories of the complete opposite, of the landing craft crews doing amazing acts of bravery, and like the two that I mentioned right at the start.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
So I mentioned the transport areas and lowering points, which are marked out there, and then the landing craft heading for the beach. Generally, the troops on board the landing craft were quite mixed in, so not a single unit all by themselves, but all a variety of units together. One key consideration early on was obstacle clearance, which I know has been talked about here before. So there were Army engineers and naval personnel on board on some of the early waves to try and clear the obstacles. And obviously, the German beach obstacles and the extent to which they'd been cleared on each particular beach had a really massive bearing on the experience of the landing craft crews, which I'll come to in a moment. So just to talk about the different beaches, I'm not going to obviously give a blow-by-blow account of each beach because we'd be here all night, but I'll attempt to do that in the book. But just to kind of pick out a few different aspects of different beaches that kind of between the lot of them will kind of cover a variety of different aspects of landing craft on D-Day. So a map of Utah Beach here, and one thing to note is just in the top right corner, the Banque de Cardonnet, the shoal of shallower water, where actually the Germans had deployed quite a lot of mines, of sea mines. And this very much comes into play as the landing craft are approaching the beaches. So quite early on, there's one of the LCTs carrying DD tanks at 5:47 in the morning. One of the 8 LCTs carrying DD tanks hits a mine, which massively destroys the craft, blows it in half. There's at least 5 crewmen killed, and 16 soldiers from the DD tank unit as well. And it seems to be really quite a shock to the crews of the other landing craft, because and they talk about this sort of situation about what they're seeing isn't just another landing craft sinking. It's they'd have identified the numbers on the different craft, and they'd have known the men serving on them because they'd been serving alongside them. And after these craft had launched their tanks, one of the empty LCTs was sunk by another mine, and 7 crew were lost. And then there's an LCF landing craft flak. So this is a view of the anti-aircraft guns on the deck of one of them. Round about 8 hour is on one of the flanks of the beach, and it's hit by a German shell and sinks really rapidly. And there were at least 23 of the crew, because they had so many guns, they had quite large crews, more than 60 men in the crew. So that craft was lost. So there's a succession of different landing craft, including an LCIL, landing craft infantry large, and it comes to 6 large landing craft that are lost, and many of them over this mined shoal. And so that's what I meant earlier when I referred to the way I suspect people often talk about Utah Beach, as in the casualties on land were really quite low. If you look at it from the landing craft point of view, it's a very different story.
Yeah.
And because with so many lost. And the other story that we always tell about Utah Beach, of course, is the fact that the landings didn't take place where it was planned, but just slightly south. So one of the control craft gets sunk, and the landings go off course. Troops start going ashore, and then Brigadier General Teddy Roosevelt lands in one of the early waves and famously says, "We'll start the war from right here," i.e. we'll keep landing here and not move to the original intended landing site. And I mean, I'm really interested if anyone has got any thoughts on this, but I'm not sure what option he had, because by that point, obstacle clearance had started. The fire support landing craft had all done their bit against that particular bit of coast. you couldn't rewind all of that. So if they landed if they somehow came off the beach and tried to land again, they'd have been landing at a site where all of those things hadn't been done. And also off the coast, stretching out for quite a considerable distance for miles, was all the other landing craft that are all heading there. So whether it was feasible really to divert all of those and actually do anything other than start the war from right here, I do have to wonder.
I've always wondered that, and General Van Fleet's granddaughter who told me, or no, daughter told me, if you wish, she said that she's not even sure that Roosevelt said that anyway, from what her father said. Was that he may not even have said it. So I'm with you. How on earth you could steer an invasion back up the coast to a different place, even if the defenses are worse where you are. That's it. That's where you are. It would. There's no for me. There's no option moving. But it's become a bedrock of D-Day history. So there it is. That's it. It's one of those stories.
And the fact that you had a kind of a juggernaut of ships and landing craft heading for the beach is something that you see at other beaches as well, and how it's difficult to, even if you want to, for example, because there's more enemy resistance than expected, it's really, certainly on a big scale, it's not really possible to depart from the plan, because it's just impossible to control so many different individual landing craft. And it's some of the other beaches, for example, in an ideal world, you'd have said, these type of landing craft, hold off, you're not going to land for say 2 hours until say 2 hours later than planned. These other landing craft, you go in early, that kind of thing. But that sort of fine detail just wasn't possible. So this is the kind of view that we often think of on Utah Beach, as I mentioned, in terms of the it being, quote, relatively easy. But actually, one thing that's mentioned a lot about the landings there is the length of time for which artillery fire went on, even if it wasn't directly aimed. It's still falling around. And there's a great account here from a US Navy officer, Eugene Banks, who was the officer in command of LCT 765, one of a group of 11 US Navy LCTs delivering artillery sometime in the middle of the day. And so he talks about, as they're on the beach, about artillery shells fall in between the LCTs, but fortunately don't actually hit anything. And then Banks is looking around, just sort of checking what the crew are doing, and he's a bit annoyed to see that the cook has come out of the galley, and he'd been told to be stationed there, ready to treat any wounded who might, if there's any wounded because of shelling, etc. So it appeared to him that he'd just come out to watch what was going on. And so after they got back off the beach, Banks goes to have a word with the cook and tell him off for this. And he writes, he didn't say a word, but just pointed to a row of holes in the side of the galley. Shrapnel had gone through the 3/8 inch mild steel plating with ease. We fished shell fragments out of our supply of flour and sugar for several days. So even, again, a time that's supposedly pretty safe, there's things like that going on.
Wow, great story.
And then, of course, Omaha Beach, as you were saying, we're all really familiar with the struggles and the difficulties of landing there. One thing that's maybe not as well known as it should is though I'm obviously not the first person to say this, is the number of British landing craft and landing ships that were there. So for the assault troops, for each half of Omaha, there were 2 American landing ships and 1 British. And then you had the Rangers, those landing at Point du Hoc, and those who landed on the main beach carried on board 6 British transport ships. So there's one of the just so that the here obviously got a view on board an LCVP, landing craft vehicle personnel, so one of the smallest types of land, obviously quite a well-known photograph. I think I've certainly had a few conversations with people over the years where I remember people being quite shocked at how vulnerable the troops were in these little landing craft, and that there wasn't sort of more people are sort of thinking that there would have been ways to make the whole experience of landing on the beaches much safer. But the problem, of course, was that there wasn't really a safer option. And so one thing that people sometimes mention is things like the landing vehicle tracked, so that were used in the Pacific.
Yep.
So amphibious vehicles. It was a bit like a cross between a amphibious tank and a landing craft. But I don't think that really would have particularly been the answer. And there would have been problems about the ships that would have carried them and so on and so forth.
You'd have to change the whole infrastructure of the entire landings to do that, and they didn't have them anyway. So it's a moot point, because where would they have got 3,000 of those things for Juno 644? So it's when people bring that up, I go, yeah, it's a what if that isn't even a what if, because it's just not possible.
Yeah, and the length of time that of a lot of the people had been trained in order to do things they do meant you couldn't just change things around at the last minute.
Yeah, exactly.
So quite early on in the landings, you start seeing LCTs landing on Omaha, and so this has an anti-aircraft unit here, and you can see really from those vehicles. So this one beached at 8:50 in the morning, that was when it first tried to beach, and actually ended up beaching at 9:40. Hit an obstacle. Its engine room flooded, so it couldn't quite get far enough in. And the vehicles you can see here tried to land, but the water was too deep, so that's why they've ended up where they are. And then the LCT was hit by mortar fire, set alight. So really a really difficult situation. And as I mentioned earlier, sometimes you then get landing craft like this, not like this one obviously, but other ones milling around trying to find a place to go. And the commander for Force O, in his report afterwards, criticizes this behavior and says, quote, "If every officer in charge of a landing craft is to disregard the force commander's order and decide for himself when to land, the chances for a successful assault are small." Which I guess he had a point, but equally, if it was hard to spot any gaps in the beach obstacles, and then many of those were jammed up with other landing craft that tried to get ashore, it was a really difficult position to get into. The bravery of the crewsmen in these crafts isn't in doubt, though, and there were two LCTs, 30 and 540, that were awarded presidential unit citations for landing under heavy enemy fire. And another type of landing craft that really has a terrible time at Omaha Beach is the landing craft infantry large. So this is LCIL 85 shown here, and the reason it's listing is because it's come under such heavy fire when it was trying to beach. Quite a number of casualties. They pulled off the beach and then eventually had to manage to take the casualties on board onto a larger ship and actually sank this craft because it was basically a write-off and a danger to shipping. So there's quite a number of really quite terrible stories of the experience of the crews of these craft and the troops on board. And then turning to Gold Beach. So one difference between from the American beaches is the presence of the funnies, the various specialist tanks. So early in the landings, you have a series of LCTs delivering them. So things like the Churchill Averies and Sherman flails. And quite a number of these run into really heavy fire and have quite a number of casualties and end up with really difficult situations. There's a number of cases where the fire support landing craft, essentially on either side of Gold Beach, roughly do a good job in, after the troops are actually ashore, continuing to fire on various different enemy targets and helping support the landings. A couple of hours into the landings, there's 47 Royal Marine Commando land in LCAs, the little British landing craft. 14 of those, one sunk by enemy fire on approach, 4 sink while beaching, and 7 are damaged by hitting beach obstacles. So that they have a really bad landing. And there's an account by one LCT crewman and witnesses who this saying that it looked to him as if the landings had failed because it was going so badly for those specific troops. And then again, the LCILs, like we just saw, that same type are used round about the middle of the day to deliver the reserve infantry brigades rather. So this picture towards the bottom, there's a couple of, so this is Gold Beach again, a couple of LCTs, but also on the right, some of the LCILs. So each one of those had 200 troops. And this particular group, or on, not this, on the other half of Gold Beach, in fact, were actually delivered by a mixture of Royal Canadian Navy and US Navy LCILs. So as well as on Omaha, for example, and equally Utah too, you've got British landing craft delivering American troops. Here you've got Canadian and US landing craft delivering British troops, simply because they were using the landing craft most suitable for delivering those particular troops rather than just going by nationality. And then, as on all the beaches, but I'm just mentioning it at this point, in the evening of D-Day, the first landing barges arrive. So this is a landing barge vehicle, and then, as I said at the start, a river barge converted to be able to land vehicles, but not suitable for the assault. So they were intended to be used for later on in the landings, and some of them cross empty, but some of them cross not necessarily carrying vehicles, like sometimes loaded with petrol or ammunition, for example. And they're part of the ferry craft, and I'll mention the ferry craft again in a moment. And as well, other ferry craft landing at Gold Beach and some of the other beaches were landing craft mechanized. So these are slightly bigger than the LCVPs and the LCAs. And in this case, at Gold Beach, manned by Royal Marines. And just an example, 698 Buildup flotilla, so one flotilla of these craft, so of the LCMs, that is, started with 15 that tried to cross for D-Day. They had to turn back because of the rough weather. A bit later on D-Day itself, 7 of them set off because the others weren't ready, mechanically weren't ready, and one of those was lost en route. So for these smaller landing craft, it's still pretty difficult getting across. And there were also 4 flotillas, that's over 60 LCVPs, so the American LCVP landing craft that were being used by the Royal Marines as ferry craft, so not in the assault, but for coming along later on to help unloading, mostly on the days following on D-Day. And I suspect people often don't realise that that there were so many of these LCVPs being used by the British, in fact.
Yep.
And then Juno. So Juno, you had, as shown on the right here, the shoal off the coast, and so that meant that the planned timings for the landings were slightly later than on Golden Sword and Golden Sword either side, and then delayed by another 10 minutes actually on the day because to allow some of the landing craft to catch up to their relative positions. And then the impact that this has on the landing craft particularly is as they're pretty soon as they start to beach, they're whereas on the other beaches they're often hitting the beach a little bit, at least at the start of the assault, a little bit short of the obstacles. The obstacles are still high and dry at that point. On Juno, they're starting to land actually amongst the obstacles, and this painting showing the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada landing captures, I think the beach is probably slightly sort of foreshortened, but you can see the LCAs there. You get a bit of quite a good sense of their size, and then landing amongst the beach obstacles. And from the troops' point of view, wasn't perhaps such a big factor in the sense that as they're approaching the beach, these landing craft are going reasonably fast. They've got enough momentum that they could steer often between the obstacles, but it's when they're coming back off the beach again, they're going much more slowly, and it's much harder to avoid the mined beach obstacles. And so there's quite a lot of losses to craft and to the personnel, to the crews as well. 25% of the 155 LCAs at Juno are lost or damaged. So it's really a substantial number. And then just to mention another type of craft. So I mentioned the LCT A for armor. This was a similar craft, LCT brackets CB standing for Concrete Buster. It's a slightly weird name, but it, like the LCTAs, it had a slightly raised platform near the bow. You can see it just looking through onto the tank deck through the gap there, and on that there'd be two tanks sitting. So generally Centaurs for the British and Canadian beaches. For this particular craft, the Concrete Buster, they had two Sherman Fireflies because they had more powerful guns. They were tasked with dealing with specific concrete strong points. And then on the American beaches, they'd have Shermans, standard Shermans, instead of the Centaurs. And a great little story of one of these, not this particular craft, but one of these at Juno Beach, LCT CB 2338. So beached at H hour, and was hit by quite a lot of German fire, which did quite a bit of damage as they were on the beach, including blowing off the ramp or the bow. And Wyman RV Weston appeared on the LCT's bridge and offered the commanding officer, Lieutenant Robert Partington, a milk tin full of petrol. And Partington recalled, I asked him what on earth it was for, and he replied that he thought the ship was sinking and that I wanted to destroy the confidential books, etc. I told him we were in enough trouble already without setting fire to the bloody ship, and they managed to get back off the beach and had to be towed back across the channel. So another one of those amusing stories that the veterans would often tell. And also at Juno Beach, we see commandos landing in landing craft infantry, small LCIS, and I'll come to those in a bit more detail on Sword Beach. And here we have the LCILs, again, landing craft infantry, large, delivering the reserve infantry brigades. So you can see these have, seeing the main photo here, the ramp either side of the bow, which was the way that the troops would generally land. But they were really quite vulnerable because they're relatively flimsy and quite easily blown off. And the other photograph, you can see the troops on deck, which looks perhaps a bit vulnerable, but actually they were often ordered on deck because the main threat was hitting a mined obstacle. So if they were, the higher up they were away from the ship's bottom, the safer they probably were. And then Sword Beach. So here we have the quite well-known story of as the fleet's approaching, there's three German E-boats fire torpedoes, break through the smoke screen that the Allied aircraft have laid, and fire torpedoes which sink the destroyer Savannah. But not too far away are six of the big landing ships carrying troops. So that shows you can start thinking about the what ifs if things had gone slightly differently and how that would have impacted on the landings.
I think that's my takeaway from Stephen Fisher's book and your book as well, is that Sword Beach is in some ways, you said there, the one that gives us the strongest idea of how things could have quite quickly gone worse if a few things had not gone the Allied way. I mean, the story of the ships and the landing craft on Sword Beach is really dramatic, certainly rivaling Omaha in terms of sheer human drama, but as you say, in terms of importance of showing how vulnerable an amphibious landing is to things that can go wrong. And we haven't even addressed coastal gunfire particularly, but that obviously a factor as well. But I'm glad you're saying this. Thank you.
And then I'm keeping moving to get to after D-Day. So here we've got one of the LCIS landing craft infantry, small, that I mentioned, were also at Juno Beach. So these were landing commandos at Sword Beach as well. So this could carry about 100 troops, so quite a substantial number of troops. It was wooden with some armour, but not a great deal of armour. And to cut a long story short, they get really badly shot up. And the commander of some of them, of one of the flotillas, Rupert Curtis, reckoned that if the Germans had used high explosive shot rather than solid shot, it might actually have blown up quite a lot of these craft, because they didn't have self-sealing fuel tanks. So these craft were more designed for, well, were designed for making stealthy raids under the cover of darkness, not really for an assault. But the Allies were making do with the variety of landing craft that they had. And then, so this is Strong Point Cod on Sword Beach, seen from the air. But just to mention, actually not here, but slightly further to the east, one of the landings that was planned as a possibility that didn't take place was Operations Frog and Deer. So there was 46 Royal Marine Commando were ready to be landed by LCAs to the east of the main landings to destroy 3 German gun batteries. But in the end, that was judged not to be necessary. And then the last thing to say, maybe for D-Day, is that although we think of D-Day obviously being the 6th of June, the actual landings, the initial waves of landings carried on for at least for 24 hours. So that's obviously there and into the 7th of June, and really for about 36 hours. So there's, in that first load of troops who've embarked before D-Day, they carry on landing for some time onto the 7th of June. And even onto the 8th. These are some figures for an attempt to summarize or give for some of the main types of landing craft the number that are present and the number that were lost or badly damaged. And this is an almost impossible thing to work out. So this is just to give a sense of what it was like. One of the reasons why it's pretty difficult is that even to someone at the time who's actually on the landing craft, it was hard to say whether their particular craft was quite lost or just so badly damaged. So the crew might have abandoned a craft on the beach, but then later on it might be possible to repair it after D-Day and save it, for example. But in general, one thing that's, I think, is the number of losses in the sense of a landing craft that's sunk off the beach. It's completely impossible to rescue it, never to be seen again. The number of in that situation is surprisingly low, but the number that have damage was much higher than it was expected. And so, as I'll come to in a moment, repair was really important to try and to cope with those. And then here's some figures for the number of landing craft and landing ship, but for D-Day mostly landing craft in the true sense of the word, crew who were killed. This is a combination of some individuals in the records of CWGC and the American Battle Mornings Commission, where they're clearly identified as landing craft crews, but also some where reports mention crewmen being killed, but don't necessarily name them. So sometimes there's a few sometimes there's a few unknowns. So this isn't a sort of definitive figure, but it's to give a bit of a sense of the sort of numbers. And so you can see Utah Beach and Juno Beach, the two that have the highest figures here, and Utah because of the number of larger landing craft which had larger crews that were lost, as I mentioned, and Juno, a lot of them is from much smaller landing craft, and the crews from those that were lost. And then starting to move on to after D-Day now. So I mentioned ferry craft before. These were landing craft and assorted other vessels that were going to remain off Normandy after D-Day to help with unloading larger vessels. So there were about 1,500 craft that were identified as ferry craft. And as well as some of the small landing craft like LCVPs and LCMs, there are also the American built LCTs, the Mark V and Mark VI, because they were designed to specifically to unload, sort of interlock with, or marry as they called it, with LSTs, some of the other types, and also, like we can see here, Rhino ferries. So this is not a landing craft, but a floating platform, which were generally they'd have been towed across by an LST, and the idea was that rather than a larger ship coming right into the beach, they could unload onto this out at sea, and then the Rhino would come in that last distance. They were a bit unwieldy, a bit vulnerable to damage, but were useful, I think, but had some problems in that respect. And another a kind of relative of the Rhino was the naval lighter pontoon, which used the same kind of structure of compartments, but rather than being in more of a rectangular shape, they were more in a line, one end on the beach, and then an LST or an LCT could come up to the end and unload, and it just meant that your vessel didn't need to come quite so close into the beach. And then here we've got quite a well-known photograph of Omaha Beach. This is once things have really got into the swing of it, so you can see lots of LSTs along the water's edge. So these are drying out in the sense that they're ending up on the beach. The tide has gone out and left them high and dry, and that at first was not was frowned upon as a way of doing it, because there were fears of damage to the ships from that method. In practice, people found that the LSTs were strong enough to do that without having any damage, so it was often that method was often used. And off the shore, you can see various larger ships, merchant vessels, etc., and those are the sort of ships that the ferry craft would have gone out to help unload and bring the cargo into the beach. The system doesn't work perfectly to start with, so one of the problems is the army doing what was called selective unloading, which is where they wouldn't ask for the whole ship to be unloaded. They'd ask for specific bits of cargo from it, and obviously that's not an efficient way of doing it, and actually finding the ship that had the cargo you wanted on wasn't necessarily straightforward. So there were things like that didn't go perfectly, but obviously the Allies managed to make it work. The Mulberry harbours, who've got an LCT alongside one of the pierheads in the Mulberry harbours, so they help with unloading, but there's still, even when they're up, the Mulberry harbours are up and running, there's still a huge proportion of supply of troops and vehicles, particularly coming unloading directly onto the beaches. And the Mulberry harbours and the gooseberries as well, which were the lines of ships sunk to create breakwaters at the other beaches, helped to shelter all the little landing craft from the storm. But still, after the storm that happens, this is the 19th to 21st of June, there's about 800 landing craft that are lost or damaged, and it's only on the 8th of July, which is when there's the next high tides, next spring tides, that about 600 of these craft, which have then been repaired in the meantime, can be refloated. So that does quite a bit of, the storm does quite a bit of damage to the fleet of landing craft.
And that's worth addressing for a second, because when I'm doing my tours, I talk about how the impact of the storm, because of the unloading, it essentially kind of delaying the Allied advances in land for a week or two, or even 3 weeks, depending on kind of how pessimistic you are. But I don't know that I considered the loss of landing craft during that time as well. I think my focus is always on kind of, well, they simply can't unload. But you said 800 ships damaged landing craft during that time.
Apparently, 800 landing craft. I think that would include quite a number of smaller craft, but would also include some like LCTs.
But that really does show that how as bad as it did slow up the Allied advance, it doesn't slow it up to a point of it being a disaster. The Normandy campaign does kind of push on, because you said about there being a sort of slight surfeit of ships earlier in the presentation, but with the storm and the loss of that boat, that could really kind of imperil progress. I guess by that point things are working generally to absorb that statistic, but I'm surprised by that. That's well done Allied logistics. I think basically is the
absolutely. And obviously you're not just losing whatever those craft might have been carrying, but the potential for them in the future days and weeks. Something I came across mentions of, but never quite found enough to really quite get to grips with it is the fact that there were a few really large barges that were landed with, which were much larger than the little landing barges like we saw a photograph of just now, which were intended as a sort of backup reserve supplies in such occasions, like if there was a storm. And I don't think I ever came across anything, and it may well be out there somewhere, but I just haven't come across it, of the extent to which they dipped into those supplies because of the storm. And then so that was ferry craft, and then the other side of landing craft after D-Day is what were known as the Shuttle Service. So ships like LSTs and, as seen here, LCTs, these are Mark IVs, and Mark IIIs, the two main British types, and the LCILs, made repeated crossings back and across the channel, going back to the UK, pick up more troops and vehicles and supplies and taking them over there. Which was obviously another essential part of the whole process of moving the troops over to Normandy. Convoys across from the UK to Normandy were known as starlight convoys, which I think was quite poetic. And this was, I think, derived because they would generally travel at night, so that as they could approach the shore. Oh, that's a nice comment. Thanks very much. They could approach the Normandy under the cover of night, and then quite appropriately maybe the return convoys were known as blue sky, because so they would be numbered, that blue sky or starlight, and then a sequential number, because they would make a return trip in daytime to try and get clear of Normandy before darkness fell and enemy threats like E-boats came out. And apparently during after a little bit after D-Day, things sort of settled down a bit, and apparently an LCT's commanding officer would often be shirtless, in shorts and gym shoes, and quote, any random bit of headgear, smoking his pipe, reading a book, or just contemplating nature, as they were just steaming across the channel. So things would sort of settle down in most cases. And I actually remember speaking to one LCT veteran who was, I think he injured his hand, not really severely, but badly enough that he was taken off his LCT and had to recover ashore. And he said he was actually quite glad at that point that he was wounded, because things were getting a bit boring, which obviously is a bit of a contrast with what's happening on land. But it very much wasn't the case that it was always like that, and particularly, well, throughout the whole of the Battle of Normandy period, there's quite a number of craft lost to enemy attack. So if you look at it on the kind of statistical level, it's a small proportion. But if you look at the examples of what it must have been like for the individual personnel, either on those craft or witnessing them, it clearly would have been pretty terrifying. So, for example, about 0400 on the 8th of June, there's up to 8 E-boats fight a 40-minute battle with torpedoes and guns against a British convoy of 14 LCTs and 3 LCILs that are heading for France, and they sink one of each type, and another LCT has its bows blown off. So that clearly would have been really pretty traumatic. And because these craft had only quite limited defensive armament, so a pair of pom-pom guns or a pair of 20mm Oerlikons, so they wouldn't have felt like they had particular defences. And over there's a number of LSTs that also sank. So on the morning of the 9th of June, for example, E-boats attack again, and there's 2 US Navy LSTs that are sunk. And there's quite a few losses amongst the crews, but also amongst the troops on board. And then even there's a few other cases of large numbers of losses. For example, 25th of June, there's 35 Royal Navy sailors killed when an LCH landing craft headquarters, which is a converted LCIL, is sunk by a mine. So these are not every day, but when one of these, obviously a larger landing craft or a landing ship has a larger crew. So if there is an incident like that, even if the vessel's not actually sunk, there's the potential for quite a substantial number of casualties. And to try and counteract or protect the anchorage off Normandy, every evening there's what's known as the trout line formed, which was a line of up to about 40 British fire support craft, sometimes with some other little craft, landing craft as well. But things like the LCF and LCGLs, the flak and gun landing craft, that form a line down the eastern side of Sword Beach as a kind of relatively expendable, more expendable than the bigger ships anyway, outer defence line against things like explosive motorboats and human torpedoes. And over the whole campaign, there's about 100 crewmen on these craft killed. There's a couple of them are sunk, and some other losses. And I think psychologically that was a really difficult for the crews, because the craft were just anchored there and essentially just having to sit there and watch out for the enemy, which would have been quite a small enemy vessel, but potentially could have caused a lot of damage. So there were still occasional, quite a lot of occasional, but when they were did turn out quite severe enemy threats.
And I guess, Andrew, someone is having to update the charts on a daily basis for, obviously if an LCA goes down it's not a hazard, but things like Liberty ships and LSTs going down, that's making that channel different. It's going to be affecting the tides, the currents, and so someone's updating charts on a daily basis for future convoys, I'm assuming.
Not 100% sure how that was done in detail, but I guess if they were sunk far enough offshore, perhaps it wasn't a problem. But certainly closer to the beach, there were some of the smaller landing craft that had a sort of survey role. So I guess they could have marked if there was a wreck close to the beach, could have marked those. And I put this slide in. This is on I think an LCA being repaired on board a ship, but it's just to represent repair in general. I mentioned before about the number of landing craft that were damaged, and so a really important part of keeping the fleet of landing craft going was repairs back in the UK. So in the Solent, for example, in the Portsmouth, Southampton area, up to the 3rd of July, the repairs have been carried out afloat to 1,021 landing craft, presumably quite a range from relatively minor to more severe, and a further 30 LCTs have been beached for repairs below the waterline. And then if there was something even more substantial repair that was needed, that would be the craft would be taken ashore for more substantial repair. So repairing is really important. And then there's a whole structure of organizations for basically keeping track of the landing craft as they were getting back to the UK, keeping track of what the army needed to ship over there, what units were going next, and then also controlling the movement of troops from the various marshalling area camps a little bit further inland, so they were coming down to the embarkation sites at more or less the right time. So in a pre-computer age, quite amazing that they managed to keep it going. As I always say, that for this sort of thing, the heroes are definitely the typists who were typing and retyping all these orders. And I'm more or less at the end here. These, as I've done for D-Day, this is an attempt to calculate the landing craft and landing ship crew deaths for not just for D-Day, but for the periods after D-Day. For the after D-Day periods, the factor that particularly increases the number is, as I mentioned, if there's particularly a larger craft or particularly an LST that's sunk or badly damaged, that can lead to a lot of crew deaths. and really increase the number in a particular month. When I started doing the book, I had, or as I was researching it, I thought about having a roll of honor in the book, but then realised fairly swiftly that would be continually evolving, and so instead that's on my website, which is given better there, so people can check there, and if anyone's got any either any questions about stuff on there, or if they think anyone's left off, then do check that out. And there are a number of landing craft crew deaths mentioned on there where the individual isn't identified. But so I've mentioned the records describe the circumstances under which a crewman was killed, but I don't have the name. So if anyone thinks they can help with that, do definitely
get in touch. Yeah,
check it out. Yeah, and so here's the book, which is for our North America audience. If there's anyone watching from over there, and will be out in the US as well next February 25.
Brilliant.
And so just the last thing to mention, you mentioned the walk run landings at the start. So a number of landing craft crews involved in those, or in Operation Dragoon, the landings in the south of France in August. And then from August onwards, the larger landing craft many of them start to be prepared to go out to the Far East. And many, so some of them, when VJ Day comes along, when the war ends in the Far East, there's a number that are either out there already or on their way out there. So remember, a number of landing craft veterans attributing their survival to the end of the war ending at that point, because they didn't fancy their chances in an invasion of Japan. And just one last story to end on. Horace Ely of 524 Assault Flotilla, so quite small landing craft. He was a veteran of North Africa, Sicily, and Salerno landings, as well as Normandy. And you'd think by that point, someone would have said, "You've done your bit. Have a break, sit out the war, and do some training." But he found himself transferred to the British Army and was sent to Burma. And he says, "I remember going through a big tent in Liverpool and getting my Navy discharge papers in one hand and my Army call up in the other."
Oh.
So, yeah, he had a bit of a rough deal.
Wow. Well, brilliant stuff. Although we have got some questions to address with. So my first thing is you're going to reference the fact you said right at the beginning, are there any people who have relatives? Well, yes, there are two who are watching. So Mr. Frickin' Fracken, my wife's uncle was a Coast Guard coxswain on Omaha. She's always said that was the only part of his service he would never recount. So we don't know what he was doing, but that's a typical story of someone not saying the worst part of their service. So if you want to get in touch with Andrew and try and find out who your wife's uncle was and what, I'm sure I can put the two of you together. And Poor 72 is saying, we lost a family member who served on LCI 524 on D-Day, able Seaman Ronald Reginald Perrett, after dropping Lord Lovat, Bill Millen elements of 47 Commando and 3 French Commandos. So another landing craft veteran or family mentioned in the sidebar there. So we'll start with the questions. So where have we got? The first one, several people were asking about the differences between LCAs and LCVPs. So the LCA being sort of armored, protected, quote unquote, the LCVP not, one having benches, one having not. But this is a representative question from Patrick. Is there any evidence of a casualty rate difference for the LCAs, the LCVPs? I'm assuming that data isn't available on D-Day specifically, about whether or not you have more chance of survival in one type over the other, I guess.
No, I don't remember seeing anything about that. I mean, I guess coming back to Saving Private Ryan again, we have that kind of mental picture of over the sides, all that sort of thing. So the LCA had the side decks which were armored, so it gives you a bit of overhead protection, which in some cases I suppose might have helped a bit. I mean, maybe it's more likely to help your chances of surviving getting off a landing craft, depending on not so much on how well protected your craft is, but whether it lands directly in front of an enemy position or in a place that's slightly more defended, and also generally what's sort of going on around you. Sometimes, for example, there were if there was a wrecked larger landing craft, you could have smaller craft that could pull up alongside it and be a bit protected. Yeah, I'm not so just thinking. I'm not sure that whether the benches would necessarily make it that much slower to exit, because it was something that was the troops would have practiced.
Yeah,
bit.
Whatever type you're going in, you've practiced it, haven't you? So yeah.
And actually, so this is just purely speculation, just thinking off the top of my head. But actually, if you've been sitting on a bench, your legs are probably in a bit better condition than if you've been sitting just on the bottom of the landing craft. So maybe conceivably that might help. And I guess also sort of seasickness and things like that would have come into play, and perhaps had a bigger impact on your ability, your sort of physical ability than
I think there's probably too many variables in play there to get a opinion. But we've got another question, and it was from Stuart Robertson.
Just another thing quickly on that is that when you see reports about LCAs and LCVPs, generally people at the time seem to dislike them on national grounds. So in other words, if you're American, you don't like LCAs, and if you're British, you probably don't like LCVPs. And
that makes more sense. Yeah, just kind of an illogical knee-jerk reaction to it being different. Yeah, that makes more sense.
And there'll always be some where there's problems. For example, there's quite a number of the LCAs that are accused of being unseaworthy because they're taking on too much water on D-Day, but that could be because they were a bit overloaded. So if they had more weight, they were sitting heavier in the ground. Sitting lower in the water, which is probably ultimately the fault of the army of overloading them. Yeah.
And as Great Dominion says there, I bet there's little difference, if any, if they take a direct hit from artillery en route. I mean, if you take a fatal hit, LCA, LCVP, even LCT, it's not going to make that much difference, I suppose. But another question from Stuart Robertson asking about landing craft telegraphs. How many landing craft telegraphs were there? Not sure if there was one central unit or subdivided beach by beach. He also said, I can't remember if they were designated LC Telegraph or LCH Landing Craft HQ, but I've never worked out how many of them there were. Do you know the answer, Mr. Whitmarsh?
So there were certainly LCHs, which were, as he says, headquarters, which were landing craft infantry large that had were converted to be, so they were designated as an LCH, but I don't think actually in practice it meant too much in terms of changes to the actual craft. And I think certainly in the assault, each infantry battalion would have an LCH, for example, so that the battalion commanding officer could be on to have some kind of command post before going ashore. Not to try and sound like I'm just trying to flog more pockets of my book, but in the one thing I included in that was an order of battle of landing craft in there, which is largely based on what was known as the Green List at the time, which was a list of really useful list of the National Archives of all the different landing craft and the different naval forces, but then also trying to adjust a bit for some changes that happened in terms of craft moving between different forces, etc. So in that it will list where how many LCHs there were.
Okay.
I don't think I've heard of a landing craft telegraph as in a specific designation, so it's probably LCHs he's thinking of.
Okay, thank you. And then got two questions about the fact that landing craft made multiple journeys one day, and the first one is an interesting point of view I've never kind of thought of. Is Sean Brennan is saying lots of accounts of infantry getting off or infantry landing craft having difficulty navigating to the correct landing area. We all know those stories of people landing in the wrong place, but finding the correct ship to reload landing craft must have been a difficult time. I've never thought about the fact that an LCA or LCVP has to go back and find the mothership. Was that a problem? I mean, you said that that with nothing, they've got to allow for confusion to not go into chaos. But are there occasions of boats not being able to find the mothership?
Yeah, I think that sort of thing is definitely a problem, and particularly thinking about the American beaches where there's some really substantial landing ships that have, say, sort of 1,500 or so troops on board. So it's really quite a large number of troops, and the landing craft carried by that ship can't offload the entire number of troops on board in one go. So they sometimes have plans where first they load the landing craft carried by that particular ship, and then there's another landing ship whose troops are landing a bit later on, and the small landing craft come from that ship instead to the first ship and unload troops from that one first. And then there's perhaps LCTs that then, having landed the vehicles that they had earlier on D-Day, then come and offload more troops from that landing ship. And so there's certainly occasions when it may not be quite so much, I suppose, about finding the right ship again, because particularly if it's one of the big landing ships, there wouldn't be dozens and dozens of those. But it's simply the delays in getting off the beach. Quite often the plan was that specific LCTs, say, would come and take more troops at a particular time, and in practice there were delays in the LCTs landing their first load of troops that caused a problem. I think there was a bit of sort of making up as they went along. So sometimes they would just use whatever landing craft were to hand to offload more troops.
Okay. And the next, Bruce is asking about how many runs certain landing craft did. So they got off the beach, went back for another load, and beached again. Because I think the same thing applies to, for example, gliders. I think people think that a glider, or sorry, C-47, it makes one flight normally and that's it. Well, obviously some did several flights that day. Is there a typical number of journeys, LCAs, LCVPs, or LCTs made on June the 6th? You know, is it one or two? Did some make 5 or 6? I mean, what's the average?
So it definitely does vary a bit. For some of the small landing craft, it sometimes it is just only one, because either because that's the plan, or because it's such an effort and takes so long to land their first load of troops, get off the beach. Sometimes with some other landing craft and their flotilla sort of sinking along the way, so they're having to rescue those crews, and then they struggle back to the landing ship with half swamped and half full of water, and that's all they do. Not all, but that's enough for D-Day. But some other small craft where they're making, and they maybe 3 at the most. I thought trips would probably typically the largest number.
That's a good answer to that. And then the next question is about the statistics. The losses you showed there was what Roderick is asking. Why the increase in August? And if you mentioned it earlier and I've forgotten what it was, then my apologies to you. But is that slide 36 or something? 30, that one there. Why is August higher than July?
Yes, I think that's particularly because of an LST that was lost, and so quite a substantial number of casualties. Not solely that, but the deaths from of crews on LSTs substantially increases some of those figures, and so obviously you could argue whether they're at landing craft or not, and that whole thing. But I certainly thought it was useful to include them all for this purpose.
No, thank you. And then on that subject of moving back and forth, Great Yamin is asking about how many trips could the average LCVP or LCA make to and from the beach before they needed to refuel, and how was refueling done?
Yeah, I don't know exactly, but I do know that those LCMs, so the sort of essentially the next slightly larger size of landing crafts from an LCVP or LCA, those that crossed the whole of the channel, some went the whole way over under their own power, they would have carried fuel in jerry cans and simply topped up the fuel en route as they needed to. And then after D-Day than for D-Day itself, you have the landing barge oil, which are landing barges carrying fuel or oil, which are there to refuel the little landing craft.
Okay, thank you. And then I think that's more or less it, although Stuart did ask, go to your day job, can you ask Andrew if there are any plans for future conferences at the DDay store? And if that's beyond your pay grade, then feel free to decline that one. But do you have an answer?
Yes, is the hope. There's lots of things going on.
Okay. Well, I think we'll leave it there. That's been a fantastic conversation, Andrew, and I want to thank you again for giving the contribution to the history of this. You and Nick Hewitt's book about the DDay shipping have added immeasurably to our understanding of the seaborne element. And it's not that we don't like reading about the infantry and the tanks and it seems that the delivery of the personnel to the beaches has been not ignored, but it's been overlooked a little bit over the years. So thank you very much for doing that. And folks, I'm back again for a kind of an Ask Me Anything show tomorrow. And then we've got John Parshall coming on Friday to talk about 1942 and the Anglo-American kind of deals post-Guadalcanal going up to Midway. So thanks everybody for your questions. Don't forget to click like and subscribe. Buy my guest books. This is Paul Woodhead for World War II TV saying I will see you all again tomorrow. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, viewers. Bye.